The courtroom was buzzing with quiet murmurs as 18-year-old Jordan Hayes walked in. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he looked like any other teenager. But the way he carried himself, calm, composed, and with an air of quiet confidence, was unusual. He wasn't there as a defendant, but no one, not even the judge, expected much from him. Judge Ronald Bishop, a man known for his impatience and sharp tongue, glanced at Jordan and let out a chuckle. "Let me guess," he said, tapping his gavel lightly. "You're here for some kind of youth program? Or did you get lost on your way to traffic court?" The courtroom erupted in soft laughter. Jordan didn't flinch. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Actually, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I'm here as legal counsel." The laughter stopped. Judge Bishop raised an eyebrow. "Legal counsel," he repeated, almost mockingly. "For whom?" Jordan turned to the man sitting beside him, Mr. Leonard Carter, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a worried expression. "Mr. Carter," Jordan said, "has been wrongfully accused of embezzlement, and I intend to prove it." Judge Bishop scoffed. "This is a court of law, kid, not a high school debate club." He leaned forward. "What kind of joke is this?" Jordan smiled slightly. "No joke, Your Honor. I'm fully prepared to present my case." For the first time, there was silence in the room. The spectators, lawyers, and even the bailiff exchanged glances. No one had expected this. Judge Bishop shook his head, clearly amused but skeptical. "Fine," he said, leaning back. "Let's see what you've got." Jordan nodded, his mind sharp and ready. This was just the beginning. Judge Bishop smirked as he adjusted his glasses, looking down at Jordan. "All right, genius," he said sarcastically. "I'll humor you. Do you even have a law degree?" Jordan met the judge's gaze without hesitation. "No, Your Honor, but I've spent the last 4 years studying law independently. I've passed the baby bar exam and have been assisting licensed attorneys in complex cases." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Self-taught, huh? This isn't a game, kid. There are rules, procedures, things you can't just pick up from books." Jordan nodded. "I understand that, Your Honor, but the law is about more than just memorization. It's about application. If I can prove my client's innocence, does it matter where I learned the law?" A few people in the courtroom murmured in agreement. The judge's smirk faded slightly. "All right," Judge Bishop said, leaning back. "Since you're so confident, let's see if you can handle a real legal proceeding. But be warned, one mistake and I'll dismiss you from this courtroom." Jordan remained unfazed. He turned to the prosecutor, a seasoned attorney named Daniel Whitmore, who was already eyeing him with mild amusement. "Mr. Whitmore," Jordan said, "let's begin." The prosecutor chuckled. "This ought to be interesting," he muttered. Judge Bishop gestured toward the jury. "Proceed," he said, still skeptical. "Let's see if you're as smart as you think you are." Jordan took a deep breath. This was his chance. He wasn't just here to make a point. He was here to win. Jordan took a deep breath and approached the jury with confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, my client, Mr. Carter, has been accused of grand theft auto. The prosecution claims he stole a car from a parking lot late at night, but there's one major flaw in their case, one they hope you won't notice." The prosecutor, Daniel Whitmore, folded his arms, smirking. "Enlighten us, then." Jordan turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, may I request Exhibit A?" Judge Bishop raised an eyebrow but nodded. The bailiff handed Jordan a set of documents, surveillance footage stills from the crime scene. Jordan held them up for the jury to see. "The prosecution alleges that my client was the man in these images," Jordan said, pointing to the grainy footage. "But let's analyze this carefully. The timestamp says 11:43 p.m. My client, however, has an ironclad alibi. He was at work, miles away, at exactly this time." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Whitmore scoffed. "Alibis can be faked. Where's your proof?" Jordan didn't flinch. "I'm glad you asked," he said smoothly. He reached into his folder and pulled out another document. "This is a time-stamped work log showing that my client clocked into his job at 11:30 p.m. and didn't leave until 6 a.m. His manager and security footage from his workplace can confirm this." Judge Bishop leaned forward, suddenly intrigued. "You're saying the prosecution charged the wrong man?" Jordan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And this is only the beginning." For the first time, Judge Bishop looked unsure. The courtroom had shifted. Jordan wasn't just holding his own. He was controlling the case. Prosecutor Daniel Whitmore wasn't going to let a teenager outmaneuver him so easily. He smirked and stepped forward. "That's quite the theory, Mr. Wright," Whitmore said, emphasizing Jordan's last name with sarcasm. "But theories aren't enough in a court of law. Let's talk about evidence." Jordan folded his arms. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Whitmore turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not be misled. The defense claims Mr. Carter was at work, but let's consider this. Maybe he clocked in, but then left unnoticed. Maybe he had an accomplice clock in for him." Jordan didn't flinch. "Interesting suggestion, but completely baseless. I have security footage from the workplace, showing my client physically present during those hours. That footage is already part of the case file." Whitmore hesitated for just a second, but he recovered quickly. "Fine. Let's assume for a moment your client is innocent of grand theft auto. What about the fingerprints found inside the stolen vehicle?" Jordan smiled. He had expected this move. He picked up another document and walked toward the jury. "Great question, Mr. Whitmore," he said confidently. "But let me ask you, if you borrowed your friend's car last week and they later reported it stolen, would your fingerprints inside automatically make you guilty?" The jury members exchanged glances, considering his point. "My client had borrowed the car before, legally," Jordan continued. "The owner himself admitted this in his initial statement. But the prosecution conveniently left that out, didn't they?" The judge's expression darkened. Whitmore clenched his jaw. Jordan could feel it. He was winning. Judge Reynolds leaned forward, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench. His smirk from earlier had faded. He wasn't ready to admit it, but the teenager standing before him wasn't just some overconfident kid. He was making solid legal arguments. Prosecutor Whitmore adjusted his tie, clearly trying to regain control of the courtroom. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is attempting to mislead the jury with emotional rhetoric." Jordan shook his head, unfazed. "I'm simply presenting facts, Your Honor. If the prosecution finds facts misleading, perhaps they should reassess their case." A few muffled chuckles echoed in the courtroom. Judge Reynolds narrowed his eyes at Jordan but didn't reprimand him. Instead, he turned to Whitmore. "Prosecutor, do you have any counter-evidence, or are you simply speculating?" Whitmore hesitated, flipping through his case files. The truth was, his case wasn't as airtight as he had originally thought. The so-called solid evidence was beginning to unravel under Jordan's scrutiny. Jordan took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, the prosecution's entire argument hinges on circumstantial evidence, fingerprints, assumptions, and a timeline that doesn't hold up. Meanwhile, I've provided a concrete alibi and proof that my client was nowhere near the crime scene." Judge Reynolds exhaled slowly. He hated to admit it, but the kid had a point. He glanced at the jury, noticing that they were now leaning in, fully engaged. Jordan was controlling the narrative, and if things continued this way, the case might take a turn no one expected. "Very well," the judge said, his voice more measured now. "We'll proceed, but Mr. Wright, I suggest you remain respectful in my courtroom." Jordan smirked slightly. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise." For the first time since the trial began, Judge Reynolds wasn't sure who had the upper hand anymore. The courtroom was thick with tension as Jordan flipped through his notes. He knew he had to deliver the next blow carefully. Too soon, and it could be dismissed. Too late, and he might lose his momentum. "Your Honor," Jordan said, stepping forward confidently, "I'd like to call a surprise witness to the stand." Prosecutor Whitmore's eyes narrowed. "Objection! The defense cannot introduce a witness without prior notice." Judge Reynolds considered the objection. "Mr. Wright, do you have a valid reason for this last-minute witness?" Jordan nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. This witness was overlooked by both the prosecution and defense. However, their testimony directly contradicts the prosecution's case. If justice is truly our goal, then this court should hear them out." The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. Jordan was walking a fine line, but his arguments were solid. "Very well. Call your witness." The doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and a man in a navy suit walked in, his posture composed but his face unreadable. "Please state your name for the record," Jordan said. The man adjusted the microphone. "Jonathan Pierce." A murmur spread through the audience. Whitmore visibly stiffened. Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Pierce, do you understand that you are under oath?" "Yes, Your Honor." Jordan stepped closer, his voice steady. Mr. Pierce, where were you on the night in question? Jonathan took a deep breath. I was with the defendant the entire night. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Whitmore shot to his feet. Objection. This is completely unexpected. Jordan turned to the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution has been operating under the assumption that my client was alone that night. This witness proves otherwise. Judge Reynolds studied Jordan for a long moment. This case had just taken a dramatic turn, and for the first time he wasn't sure how it would end. The courtroom erupted into whispers as Jonathan Pierce's words settled over the room. The revelation that the defendant had an alibi, one that had been conveniently ignored, sent a shockwave through everyone present. Prosecutor Whitmore clenched his jaw, his usual smug demeanor replaced with visible frustration. He adjusted his tie and forced himself to remain composed. Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defense is clearly attempting to manipulate the court with an unverified witness. Jordan, unshaken, turned to Pierce. Mr. Pierce, can you tell the court exactly where you and my client were that night? Jonathan nodded. We were at a charity gala, a fundraiser for the city's youth education program. There were dozens of witnesses, security cameras, and a guest log. I'm sure the prosecution can verify this. The judge leaned forward, suddenly intrigued. Mr. Whitmore, did your office ever investigate this alibi? Whitmore shifted uncomfortably. We didn't find it relevant at the time. Jordan let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Not relevant? You built your case on the assumption that my client was at the scene of the crime, yet you failed to verify an alibi that could prove otherwise? The tension in the room thickened as the spectators murmured. Even Judge Reynolds seemed unimpressed with Whitmore's response. Your Honor, Jordan continued, I request that we subpoena the event's security footage and guest log immediately. If my client was indeed at the gala, this entire case crumbles. The judge sighed, rubbing his chin. Mr. Whitmore, I expect an explanation, but for now, I will allow the request. Court is adjourned until further notice. As the gavel struck, Whitmore's face paled. He had lost control of the case, and Jordan knew it. The genius teenager had just turned the entire trial on its head. As the courtroom emptied, Prosecutor Whitmore stormed toward his team, his face red with frustration. How did we miss this? He hissed at his assistant. An entire charity gala? This kid is making a mockery of us. Meanwhile, Jordan calmly walked over to his client, Marcus. We're close, he assured him. Once that footage is verified, they won't have a case left. Marcus nodded, his hands still trembling. I can't believe they ignored my alibi. Jonathan Pierce approached them, placing a firm hand on Marcus's shoulder. Some people only see what they want to see, son. But Jordan here, he's not letting them get away with it. Across the room, Judge Reynolds remained seated, deep in thought. He had underestimated Jordan from the beginning, dismissing him as an arrogant teenager. But now he saw something else, a mind sharper than most seasoned attorneys. Mr. Whitmore, Reynolds finally said, halting the prosecutor mid-stride, I expect your team to verify this alibi by tomorrow. If it checks out, you better have a good reason why this trial is still happening. Whitmore forced a stiff nod, but inside, he was panicking. If the footage confirmed Marcus's alibi, his entire case would collapse. His reputation was already on the line, and losing to a teenager would be a career-ruining embarrassment. That night, Jordan worked tirelessly, preparing for the next day. He knew Whitmore wouldn't go down without a fight. But he was ready, because the truth was on his side, and soon the whole court would see it. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Whispers buzzed through the crowd. Everyone was eager to see what would happen next. The tension in the air was thick as Judge Reynolds took his seat, his gaze shifting between Jordan and Prosecutor Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, the judge said, have you reviewed the security footage? Whitmore cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. Yes, Your Honor. The footage from the charity gala does indeed show the defendant Marcus at the event during the time of the alleged crime. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Jordan remained expressionless, though a spark of victory flickered in his eyes. So, Jordan said, stepping forward, that means Marcus couldn't have committed the crime. Whitmore straightened his tie, trying to maintain control. While this evidence does suggest he wasn't at the scene, it doesn't mean he's innocent. There are still... Judge Reynolds cut him off with a sharp look. Mr. Whitmore, you built your entire case on Marcus being at the scene. Now we have undeniable proof that he wasn't. Are you seriously telling me you want to proceed? Whitmore hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Your Honor, we would like to request a continuance. Jordan smirked. A continuance, or more time to cover up the fact that you falsely accused an innocent man? Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Whitmore clenched his jaw. Judge Reynolds sighed and shook his head. I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Blake. This case is falling apart. Unless you have something solid, I may have to dismiss the charges. Jordan looked over at Marcus, who was holding his breath. The moment of truth was near, but Jordan knew Whitmore wasn't going to give up that easily. Judge Reynolds leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The courtroom was filled with murmurs, tension hanging in the air. He had spent years presiding over cases, but this one had taken an unexpected turn. A teenager, no, a legal prodigy, had just exposed flaws in a case that should have been airtight. Jordan stood tall, his confidence unwavering. He had come too far to let Marcus suffer from a wrongful conviction. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Reynolds finally said, his voice heavy, you claimed you had an ironclad case against Mr. Marcus Johnson. But now we have security footage that directly contradicts your argument. What do you have to say for yourself? Whitmore's face reddened. Your Honor, while the footage suggests Marcus wasn't at the scene, that doesn't automatically mean he's innocent. He could have. Jordan interrupted, his tone sharp. With all due respect, Prosecutor Whitmore, you're grasping at straws. If Marcus wasn't at the scene, how could he have committed the crime? The prosecution's job is to present facts, not assumptions. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the jurors exchanged uncertain glances. Judge Reynolds sighed. Mr. Whitmore, do you have any other evidence linking Marcus to the crime? Whitmore hesitated. We have a witness statement. Jordan smirked. A witness statement that contradicts video evidence? The judge exhaled sharply. Mr. Whitmore, I'm warning you. If your witness testimony contradicts factual evidence, this court has no choice but to question the integrity of your case. Whitmore swallowed hard. I need time to reevaluate. Judge Reynolds narrowed his eyes. Very well. Court is adjourned until tomorrow. But Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you think very carefully about whether you wish to continue down this path. As the gavel slammed down, Jordan turned to Marcus with a knowing look. They weren't done yet, but they were winning. The courtroom emptied, but the tension remained thick in the air. Prosecutor Whitmore stormed into his office, slamming the door behind him. His hands trembled as he shuffled through his papers. How had a teenager managed to outmaneuver him in front of the entire courtroom? His assistant, a young lawyer named Claire, hesitated before speaking. Sir, maybe we should reconsider. Whitmore cut her off. Reconsider? Are you serious? That kid just made a fool out of me. He threw a stack of documents onto his desk. We need something, anything, to take back control of this case. Claire hesitated. But sir, the security footage, it directly proves Marcus wasn't there. If we push this further, we might be accused of misconduct. Whitmore clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to lose to a teenager. Find me another angle. I don't care what it takes. Meanwhile, Jordan sat across from Marcus in a quiet corner of the courthouse. They're panicking, Jordan said with a smirk. Whitmore knows he's losing. Marcus, still overwhelmed, shook his head. I can't believe this is happening. You've done more for me in 2 days than my last lawyer did in months. Jordan leaned forward. We're not done yet. Whitmore is desperate. That means he's dangerous. We need to be ready for whatever he throws at us next. As the two talked, a court clerk approached Jordan. Judge Reynolds wants to see you in his chambers. Jordan exchanged a glance with Marcus before standing up. Guess it's time to see what the judge really thinks of me. With his heart pounding, Jordan walked toward the judge's chambers, knowing that whatever happened next could change everything. Jordan stepped into Judge Reynolds' chambers, his confidence unwavering despite the stern look on the judge's face. Reynolds sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, studying Jordan with unreadable eyes. You certainly know how to put on a show, Mr. Wright, Reynolds said, his tone laced with both amusement and skepticism. Jordan remained calm. I only presented the truth, Your Honor. The prosecution ignored crucial evidence, and my client was being railroaded. Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temples. Do you know how many years I've been on this bench? I've seen seasoned attorneys crumble under pressure, but you're a teenager who just outmaneuvered one of the toughest prosecutors in the state." Jordan's expression didn't waver. "With all due respect, sir, the law doesn't discriminate by age." Reynolds chuckled dryly. "Perhaps not, but the courtroom does. You've made enemies today, son. Whitmore is already looking for ways to discredit you. And let's be honest, if you weren't as sharp as you are, I'd have held you in contempt." Jordan crossed his arms. "I understand the risks, but I won't back down. Marcus is innocent, and I intend to prove it." Reynolds studied him for a moment, then leaned forward. "Listen to me carefully. The law is more than just knowing facts. It's a game of strategy, politics, and unfortunately egos. You've rattled people today, and they won't take it lightly." Jordan met his gaze, unwavering. "I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to win justice." Reynolds sighed, then nodded. "Very well, but tread carefully, Mr. Wright. You might have surprised the court today, but the real battle has just begun." The next morning, Jordan arrived at the courthouse, prepared for another intense day. But as he stepped inside, he immediately sensed something was wrong. The whispers, the side glances, the smirks, something had changed overnight. As he took his seat at the defense table, he saw Prosecutor Whitmore approaching with a smug expression. She placed a thick file on the desk in front of him. "Hope you had a good night's sleep, Mr. Wright," she said coolly. Jordan raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Whitmore's grin widened. "New evidence. Just uncovered this morning. And guess what? It changes everything." Judge Reynolds entered the courtroom, his face unreadable as he took his seat. The bailiff called the court to order. "Miss Whitmore, you may proceed," Reynolds said. Whitmore stood. "Your Honor, the prosecution has obtained newly discovered evidence that directly contradicts the defense's claims. We request a review of this material before proceeding further." Jordan remained calm, though he knew this was a calculated move. The prosecution was playing dirty, trying to shake him. He took the file and began flipping through it. Photos, statements, financial records, things that hadn't been in the initial discovery. "This evidence wasn't presented before," Jordan said firmly. "Why is it only appearing now?" Whitmore shrugged. "Sometimes things get overlooked. You know how it is." Judge Reynolds tapped his gavel. "Mr. Wright, do you need time to review this?" Jordan hesitated. He could request a delay, but that would give Whitmore the upper hand. Instead, he closed the file. "No, Your Honor. Let's proceed." Whitmore's smile faltered for just a second. Jordan had just called her bluff. The courtroom fell silent as Jordan stood, adjusting his tie with a confidence that unnerved Prosecutor Whitmore. She had expected him to stall, to ask for more time, but instead, he was ready to fight back immediately. "Your Honor," Jordan said, holding up the file Whitmore had presented. "This so-called new evidence is an obvious attempt to blindside the defense, but let's examine it piece by piece." Judge Reynolds leaned forward. "Proceed." Jordan flipped to the first page, a financial record. "According to this, my client received a wire transfer of $10,000 from an anonymous source, supposedly a bribe." He turned to the jury. "But if you look closely at the account details," he held up a document he had pulled earlier from his research. "The sender's bank is flagged for fraudulent transactions. This evidence is unreliable at best, fabricated at worst." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Whitmore's smirk faded. Jordan continued, flipping to a set of photos that allegedly placed his client at a crime scene. "These time-stamped images are meant to prove my client was present at the time of the incident. However," he turned to the judge, "Your Honor, I request permission to display a short security footage clip." Reynolds nodded. The screen lit up, showing a video Jordan had retrieved the night before. It was security footage from a gas station, clearly showing his client miles away from the alleged crime scene at the exact time in question. Whitmore's face turned pale. Jordan turned back to the jury. "The prosecution expects you to believe in last-minute evidence, but facts don't lie, and the truth is right in front of you." Judge Reynolds sighed, rubbing his temple. "Miss Whitmore, do you have an explanation for this discrepancy?" Whitmore hesitated. For the first time in the trial, she had nothing to say. The tension in the courtroom was thick. Prosecutor Whitmore fumbled through her notes, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The jury had seen the truth. Her case was crumbling. Judge Reynolds exhaled, glancing at Jordan. Mr. Carter, do you have any final statements before we proceed? Jordan nodded. He turned to the jury, his voice steady and compelling. Ladies and gentlemen, we have witnessed a desperate attempt to convict an innocent man. The prosecution relied on fabricated evidence, half-truths, and intimidation, but the facts do not support their claims. My client is not only innocent, he is a victim of a system that tried to railroad him. The jury members exchanged glances, nodding slightly. Whitmore, sensing her case slipping away, stood up. Your Honor, Judge Reynolds raised a hand, silencing her. Enough, Miss Whitmore. He looked at the jury. You have heard the arguments. Have you reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, stood up. We have, Your Honor. She unfolded a piece of paper and cleared her throat. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. A wave of relief washed over Jordan's client as he collapsed into his chair, tears welling in his eyes. Gasps and murmurs filled the courtroom, followed by applause from the spectators. Judge Reynolds banged his gavel. Order in the court. He turned to the prosecution. This case should have never made it this far. I expect a full review of how such unreliable evidence was introduced. Whitmore swallowed hard, avoiding Jordan's gaze. Jordan, however, wasn't done. He approached the bench. Your Honor, I'd also like to file a formal complaint regarding prosecutorial misconduct. An innocent man was nearly convicted due to deliberate deception. Reynolds sighed, nodding. I will take that under consideration. As the courtroom emptied, people whispered about the young lawyer who had turned the trial on its head. Reporters swarmed Jordan, eager to know his story. Judge Reynolds watched from his seat, shaking his head in disbelief. He had underestimated Jordan Carter. But now, he understood. This wasn't just a teenager. This was a legal prodigy, and the world was about to know it too. If you were inspired by Jordan Carter's incredible courtroom battle, don't forget to like, share, and 10,000 subscribe for more powerful stories like this. What would you do if you witnessed such injustice firsthand? Comment below and let's discuss.